Did you guys know that words like blackmail, blacklist, and black sheep are now politically incorrect and offensive to use in modern culture because it paints blackness in a negative light? Likewise, the word master is being removed from computer science and being replaced with main. Interestingly, hip hop culture embraces the word master, with MC standing for Master of Ceremonies, and rappers like Master P, Master Killa, and DJs like Funk Master Flex all using the word. So some people might argue that we're taking racial sensitivity too far. It may then surprise you that we'll still say redheaded stepchild, implying that redheads are undesirable, or a blonde moment, suggesting that blondes are stupid. What do these two expressions have in common? You guessed it, they're mocking white people. We've even added Karen as a new pejorative in recent years, and books like White Fragility are New York Times bestsellers. Why, in this racially sensitive time, are we generalizing all white folks as fragile? What exactly is happening here? Wokeism, or Marxism, is an ideology most commonly discussed within the context of economics, where society is divided into a simplistic binary of oppressor and oppressed. In Marxist thought, these are labeled as the bourgeoisie and proletariat. Communism, derived from Marxist theory, is where the proletariat overthrows the capitalist bourgeoisie to create a classless and equal society. In Marxist thinking, equality is the highest virtue of all. It overrides freedom, profit, and everything in between. Social Marxism applies these concepts to culture, and it's mostly broken down in three subcategories: race Marxism, which is best characterized by Black Lives Matter activists; sexuality Marxism, which is driven by the LGBTQ activists; and gender Marxism, which is driven by third wave feminism. You'll notice at the top of all three pyramids, straight white men, which are the apex predators of oppression. When you combine all three of the cultural Marxist categories, you get the comprehensive oppression hierarchy. This is how wokies can label you based on your race, sexuality, and gender and decide whether you're above or below them in an oppression hierarchy. Depending on where you rank, you're allowed to punch up at more privileged groups, but you can't punch down at more oppressed groups. Most people experience this new thing in their day-to-day lives when faced with identity politics, or what some would call the oppression Olympics.
You've never experienced oppression in your entire fucking life. Neither have I. You're fucking a white male. You're a white man.
You'll notice the hierarchy puts white gays as more privileged than heterosexual men of color, but there's no mention of white trans. The woke leadership who control Western culture decided to later rank them as more oppressed than heterosexual men of color, and this led to a high-profile culture war between Twitter trans activists and comedian Dave Chappelle. Chappelle discussed his disagreement with these woke ideologues across a series of Netflix specials, as he argued that being black is more oppressive than being trans, thus granting him the right to punch up at trans activists who he deems as more privileged than him.
I was like, how the fuck are transgender people beating black people in the discrimination Olympics?
And she said, do you mind not punching down on my people? She kept calling transgenders her people. Isn't that weird? I said, what do you mean your people? Was y'all kidnapped in Transylvania and brought here as slaves?
While Netflix was under immense pressure from woke activists to cancel Chappelle, the woke overlords couldn't make enemies with the greatest black comedian of all time, as that could lead to political infighting within the woke ranks and stunt the progress of their movement. Ultimately, it seems they made a concession to Chappelle, as he was never cancelled by Netflix. Cultural Marxism has overtaken mainstream culture, and that explains why you can no longer say black sheep, but you can say red-headed stepchild, even though they're both describing the same thing. The former is seen as punching down, while the latter is punching up. But first, how did we get here, and what's behind the rise of these cultural Marxist movements? Wealth inequality increases every year, with the top 1% now owning over 40% of everything, and this is only increasing while middle-class salaries have stagnated for decades. In 1930, economist John Maynard Keynes believed that the standard work week would only be 15 hours by now with all the technological innovations we've made to increase efficiency, yet Most people work longer hours now for the same quality of life their parents had, and corporations are pocketing the difference. Many believe we are in late-stage capitalism, where oligarchs are monopolizing the system in their favor and raising barriers to entry for competitors. A lot of this was accelerated with outsourcing of the middle class and automation. Most futurists believe socialism is the next inevitable phase. Gradually, as AI takes all of our jobs, from low skill to high skill, the economic output will only increase, but fewer people will be employed, and this makes UBI inevitable. In the end, futurists believe we'll live in a utopia where only 1% of super geniuses work to guide the path forward for AI, and the rest of the population lives off UBI and spends their days working on hobbies they enjoy or just chilling in the metaverse. When they reflect back on our era, they'll see it the way we saw how hard our grandparents had to work when they'd walk to school 10 miles barefoot or whatever. Because the United States is essentially a plutocracy, it's difficult to raise taxes on the rich. But if wealth inequality gets any worse, it could lead to a revolution. So our leadership, stuck between a rock and a hard place, is dragging its feet on rolling out economic Marxist policies and instead appeasing the population with cultural Marxist policies and woke propaganda to buy time. The Disney Pixar film Soul is a good example of woke propaganda. The main character is a broke middle school music teacher, but the film pushes the idea that his life is more fulfilling because he has soul.
Make a trade?
Looks like another hedge fund manager.
In this scene, they find the lost soul of a hedge fund manager and reunite the soul with his body, which is shown being miserable at his soulless job.
That's me. Thank you. What am I doing with my life? I'm alive! I'm alive! Free yourself!
So the audience is to take away that money isn't everything. Most rich people must be miserable in their soulless jobs anyways. Sorry, buddy, but as a hedge funder myself, I promise you that we are happy. We have celebrities like Katy Perry performing at our company parties, and we have steak dinner outings every other week. We date the pretty blonde bottle service girls and cute baristas that you daydream about. So our lives are actually very fun, but I wouldn't want brokies to riot and start a revolution, so I'll just say that I made that up. Also, take note that the races of these characters isn't a coincidence, which lets me segue into the next section. Race Marxism is best captured by Black Lives Matter. Unfortunately, due to the painful history of slavery and racism in the Americas, African Americans have been marginalized and still make up a lot of the lower income households and occupations. They are then disproportionately impacted by outsourcing, automation, and most recently the pandemic, which most impacted blue-collar workers who couldn't easily work remotely from home. Most people didn't know this, but black youth unemployment was 3 times higher than that of their white counterparts during the early pandemic. This was the reason why looting was so prevalent after the George Floyd incident. The mainstream narrative was that it was about racism, but that doesn't make sense considering race relations have been gradually improving over the last few decades, with increases in interracial dating and marriages, black and white entertainers making more music and films together, and our first black president serving the full 2 terms. If it was about racism by the police specifically, then that doesn't make sense either, since an unarmed white man named Tony Timpa was killed in the exact same way as George Floyd was only a few years earlier, and the police swept it under the rug. What's noteworthy is that Timpa suffocated under the cop's body weight for 14 minutes, while Floyd was on the ground for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. This number was used as evidence of police racism by BLM activists, with Dave Chappelle even naming his Netflix special after it. Rather than discussing reform within the police department, all of the proposed BLM solutions had to do with communal ownership by defunding the police and pushing other Marxist policies. The founders were openly Marxist, and their solutions to racism were all economic policy changes. One noteworthy policy change was Uber waiving fees for black-owned businesses. If you think about it, it's a perfect example of a sleight-of-hand cultural Marxist policy. Rather than taxing the rich, you can tax whites by waiving fees on blacks. It replaces the bourgeoisie and proletariat with white and black. For those not following, by waiving fees for black businesses, You're taking profits from competing white businesses since the market for delivery food is a fixed size. This is an imperfect solution because there are rich black folks and poor white folks as well, but it was a way to pass Marx's policies without calling it that, and anyone pushing back could be called racist, which nobody wants to be called. To be clear, I am a fan of these policies and a strong believer in race-based affirmative action, because it isn't healthy for a country to have clearly segregated lines where some races hold some jobs. It creates resentment and adds to stereotyping, which is bad for social cohesion. Social harmony is critically important in multicultural countries like the United States, where a race war could devastate the entire economy. So, to summarize this section, Black Lives Matter wasn't about racism, it was about economics. In the above graph, I searched Google Trends for the keywords Black Lives Matter and keyword pandemic and plotted the results. Notice the first spike as the pandemic first hit in March of 2020, then the subsequent spike from Black Lives Matter shortly afterwards. Now compare that with the black unemployment rate below. Do you notice the trend? Now compare that with the previous graph on interracial marriage approval rates. I know correlation doesn't imply causation, but does interest in BLM seem related to systemic racism to you? Or economic hardship? In a country with a population of 330 million, people of all races are unjustly killed by cops, as I outlined with the Tony Timpa killing. So why would the George Floyd incident be evidence of rampant systemic racism? Look at how interest in BLM has declined along with the black unemployment rate. When's the last time you heard of a BLM protest? There are still black people being shot by police every year. Where's all the activists? Don't they care about systemic racism? BLM was a Trojan horse movement that capitalized on a high-profile killing to attempt to push through Marxist reforms under the guise of anti-racism. Because our leaders aren't doing more for the black population economically, they're instead trying to mollify them psychologically through films like Soul and The Black Little Mermaid, and dogpiling on white women by calling them privileged Karens with fragile egos. This is kind of like your boss saying he won't give you a raise, but then telling you how deserving you are of one, and making fun of the executives of your company, saying they're probably miserable with their gas-guzzling new sports car and how their trophy wives are probably cheating on them with the pool boy. As for whites, this diagram captures their situation well. Within the existing cultural Marxist framework, there is no way for them to escape the shame of being called racist. This keeps them humble and apologetic at all times, which reduces the likelihood of a race war. So cultural Marxism is a way to create the illusion of more equality between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat by encouraging punching up and disallowing punching down. If the wealth gap is widening, at least the respect gap is tightening, is their reasoning. While there's a lot to unpack here, I'll probably spend the least time on this since it has the least relevance to my channel's content. Sexuality Marxism basically puts straight people as the oppressors and LGBTQ as the oppressed. Gallup polls put 7.2% of the US population as LGBTQ, which more than doubled since 2012. I'll let you speculate on why that might be, but I'm sure it's a multivariate explanation with a little bit of people feeling safer to come out of the closet and a little bit of people thinking it's trendier by claiming to be bi, for example. What's interesting is that polls show 12% of regular TV show characters and 20% of films now have LGBTQ characters, whereas it was 0 a few decades ago. Considering that LGBTQ folks would watch straight films, but many straight folks wouldn't watch LGBTQ films, it's asking studios to take a big economic hit to create this representation for this minority community. This is how sexuality Marxism shows parallels with economic Marxism. It's asking the system to sacrifice efficiency and profit for increased equality. For example, most of my straight male friends feel uncomfortable watching some of the gay sex scenes between men in films, so they'd avoid watching films in that category, while LGBTQ folks tend to be okay with straight sex scenes in films. Perhaps this is simply an example of closed-mindedness on the part of straight people, and the progressives want us to get used to gay sex scenes. I don't have a strong opinion either way. With the Gay Pride Month being 1/12 of the year, or 8.3% of the year, and 12% of show characters being LGBTQ, it seems they're now overshooting the 7.2% population that might prefer equal representation here. With regard to bathrooms, about 5% of the US population is trans, so to add a third bathroom category to have everyone mix in the same bathrooms seems to make some of the 95% of non-trans uncomfortable. This again doesn't seem like it makes sense to inconvenience the majority to appease a minority, but Marxism doesn't work like that. Achieving equality is more righteous than practical considerations like safety or efficiency, so we're seeing these new bathroom policies take shape across the country now. As for women's sports, trans are the T in LGBTQ, so straight women are the oppressors and transsexuals are the oppressed. This means any valid argument you can make about how someone with male bone structure will still have a physical advantage after they transition will be countered with the ad hominem attack of being called transphobic, which will end the discussion with you being shamed out of the room. This ad hominem retort actually works for all cultural Marxist categories: racist, homophobic or transphobic, and sexist. One of the primary strengths of cultural Marxism is that it's categorizing groups with immutable characteristics, so the ad hominem attacks hit harder than calling someone classist for defending the bourgeoisie. Classism is a softer insult because people can change classes. First wave feminism was the suffrage movement getting women the right to vote. Second wave was the right to work. But after this, women had equal rights to men. So what's third wave feminism? The first two waves secured equal opportunities for women, but the third wave is pushing for equal outcomes, otherwise known as equity. While equity sounds similar to equality, it's quite different. Equal opportunities are encouraged within capitalism, but equity is Marxism. The problem with these diagrams is it assumes we have spare boxes to stand on. In reality, the only way to force equality in a naturally unequal world is to reduce everyone to the lowest common denominator. For example, IQ is generally static, so you can't raise the IQ of the dumbest person in your class. If you want things to be equal for him, you have to lower the IQ of everyone else. This is why the standard for English has declined over the decades as we try to be more inclusive of lower IQ people who have a more limited vocabulary. Call it linguistic Marxism, if you will. The very fact that this movement is called woke and not awake is evidence of that. Equity, or communism, has never worked because people won't work hard just to have the fruit of their labor stolen from them. This is captured in the Laffer curve, which captures the tipping point at which raising taxes no longer raises the tax revenue collected by government, since business owners would just leave the country with their businesses or sell their company and retire. But back to gender Marxism. Of the three cultural Marxist subcategories, gender Marxism is the one that makes the least sense. Women as a whole never experienced slavery, and they have their own bathrooms. Yes, they had it worse in the past, but things like the right to vote were tied with conscription, so men were required to fight in wars to get the right to vote. Today, women still get women-only scholarships and affirmative action policies, despite there being more women who graduate from college than men. Not just college, but medical school, dental school, and so on. Since feminism removed the stigma of promiscuity, women can sleep around with top chads in their 20s while 1 in 3 men remain virgins. All data seems to indicate that the pendulum has already swung too far on feminism, yet the victim narrative continues.
I'm really fucking annoyed how white women have the fucking balls to throw my white privilege in my face, you know? Sort of separate themselves from these white males with their white male privilege. It's like, bitch, you're sitting in the jacuzzi with me. The fuck are you talking about?
Many male-female dynamics are zero-sum in nature, and when feminism got women more rights, it took away rights from men. One obvious example is abortion. When there's a surprise pregnancy, there are only 4 possibilities. In the case where they both want to keep it, or they both want to abort it, the decision is simple, so let's eliminate those. Now of the remaining 2, the woman gets her way for both. In fact, the woman gets her way in all 4 possibilities from the outset. Now I understand that it's the woman who is burdened with childbearing, so it's her body, her choice, and that's valid. But if the man doesn't want the child, then why should the man be responsible for financing it? How is that equal? Or in the wise words of Dave Chappelle,
If you can kill this motherfucker, I can at least abandon him. It's my money, my choice.
the oppressor-oppressed paradigm is outdated, and if anything, it's now reversed. But that doesn't fit the mainstream gender Marxist narrative, so women are still seen as victims, and men, by default, the victimizers. I think a lot of men aren't capable of analyzing exactly why they feel cheated by the gender Marxist status quo, but they don't like it, and that shows through the rise of the manosphere. You have MRAs, MTOW, and Passport Bros, to name a few. The common theme across all of them is that feminism is toxic and unfair, and men should either fight back or walk away. Mark Twain is credited with saying, "History may not repeat itself, but it rhymes." This again draws parallels with economic Marxism. When the capitalist business owner is overtaxed, as we saw in France for example, they'll first fight with politicians to try to change the system, or move with their business to another country with more favorable tax policies, or sell their business and refuse to work so hard just to be taxed of their labor. When gender Marxism taxes men by calling them toxic, man-spreading mansplainers and encouraging unbridled hypergamy in women, leaving average men with entitled harlots to choose from, who mostly use them for foodie dates and say it's justified because of the patriarchy, men respond in the same way as the business owners did in France. First, they'll try to fight the system, which is what MRAs do. Or they'll leave the country, which is what M-Town Passport Bros do. Or they'll check out of society and give up the fight, which captures the increasing percentage of men who play video games and watch adult content and don't even bother trying to date women. Basically, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, and they're voting with their feet. So that's the big picture of why gender relations are the way they are today. That's also why red pill manosphere types are right-leaning politically. This includes Pearl, Whatever Podcast, and Fresh and Fit. Ideologically, being anti-feminist is just a subset of being anti-woke. The case of Fresh and Fit is most interesting because of their all-black staff. About 90% of African Americans vote for Democrats as the race Marxist piece benefits them, but Fresh and Fit are from Barbados and Sudan respectively, so they remain ideologically consistent with their anti-woke position despite getting pushback from many of their African American listeners.
This is typical leftist propaganda that poisons a lot of women and people in the West in general, where you don't want to take accountability. You want to blame society and the past. I can't sell drugs and say, yo, man, it's because I'm black and it's systemic racism. I can make all the excuses in the world.
Like the place I work for, we literally give money to black businesses so we can be good.
Okay, that's racism in itself.
How is it?
Let's talk about that.
That's true.
That's black supremacy.
You have said that black Americans are lazy, that they're soft, that they're pussy and they're bitches. To put it in verbatim.
Well, that is not verbatim because I never said all black people are like that. I just said I said the black community likes to take on the victim mindset a lot of the times as to, civil injustices and use that as an excuse for why they're not where they want to be.
While I respect their adherence to their principles, it divides their audience since most people are racially tribal, and so their black audience is torn between supporting Fresh and Fit and disliking their political views on race. This likely explains why copycats like Just Pearly Things and Whatever Podcast are able to leapfrog Fresh and Fit in subscribers despite copying everything Myron says. Their white audiences don't mind their right-leaning political views, and now with Fresh and Fit demonetized from YouTube, Brian Atlas and Pearl Davis can go on to become the Eminem and Iggy Azalea of the Red Pill podcast space. Okay, I realize this was a long one, but I felt it was important to lay out my foundational viewpoints before delving into more nuanced and targeted downstream topics. Truly understanding modern feminism, why it exists, and where it goes wrong, requires understanding the big picture and the framework it exists in. If you liked the video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.